Boa tarde a todos, espero que todos estejam me ouvindo e vendo bem. Meu nome é Alexia Teles do Covne, eu sou professora da Universidade Federal de Minas Gerais, e hoje eu vou ter o imenso prazer de apresentar o professor Thor Nesset na série Abralim ao vivo, né? Eu vou falar só um pouquinho do professor, que é extremamente simpático e que eu tenho certeza que a gente vai poder aproveitar muito dos conhecimentos dele. O professor, ele tem um PhD da University of Oslo, da Noruega. Ele é professor da Universidade da Noruega em Tromsø desde 1997, e lá ele é professor de linguística da russa. O professor Nesset tem os interesses relacionados à pesquisa dele são linguística cognitiva, linguística de corpos e a diacronia. Ele já publicou várias monografias, artigos e livros também, né, relacionados à linguística. O texto, talvez o livro mais interessante dele seja o Abstract Phonology na Concrete Model, da Mouton de Gruyter, em 2008. Ele também publicou How Russian Came to Be the Way It Is, pela Slavica Publishers, em 2015. E ele tem vários artigos que são de muito interesse para nós, dos estudos diacrônicos, dos estudos de mudança linguística, de variação e mudança também, né? E ele é um grande conhecedor da fonologia, da morfologia e da sintaxe russa. Eu queria agradecer a presença do público e queria agradecer também a presença do professor, né, que está aqui, e agradecer a iniciativa da Abralim de nos disponibilizar esse conhecimento, né? O público pode, a qualquer momento, acessar e fazer perguntas, fazer comentários pelo chat, e eu espero que vocês gostem do que a gente tem aqui para apresentar para vocês. Então, vamos lá? Hi, Professor. Would you like to start your presentation?
Thank you very much. Absolutely. Let me start by sharing my screen. Share. And then we need to go to presentation mode. Now I believe you can see my, my presentation. And I would like to start by thanking the organizers for inviting me to give a presentation here today. It is a great honor and pleasure for me to take part in this great series of talks. And I think it's wonderful that we linguists can be together in this way during the pandemic. I'm going to be talking about corpus data today and connect corpus data to language change. So, but before I go into the corpus studies, let me take one step back and use the information revolution as my first heading here. During my lifetime, there has been an information revolution in the world. We used to kind of be isolated and not have access to much information. And then suddenly came the internet and social media and so on and so forth. And suddenly we have, we're overwhelmed by information. And there has been an information revolution in linguistics too, because we have now access to large electronic corpora for many, many languages. Those are large searchable electronic resources with lots and lots of text. Since we now have access to very, very large amounts of linguistic data, we sort of are in a new situation. And the question is, what are the implications for linguistics? And in particular, I'm going to be talking about historical linguistics. So I'm interested in finding out how we can use corpus data to study language change. And I'm going to be discussing these questions based on concrete case studies from Russian. But if you don't speak or know anything about Russian, please don't despair. I think the points I'm going to be making are kind of general interest, and I'm going to try to explain the data I'm using in a user-friendly way. So what I'm going to do is to go through 6 case studies, if time permits. We might have to skip 1 or 2. We'll see how things go. These are case studies that I have conducted together with my colleagues in the CLEAR research group. And CLEAR is an acronym. It stands for Cognitive Linguistics Empirical Approaches to Russian. And we are based at the UiT, the Arctic University of Norway. So these are studies about Russian from the far, far north of Europe. In fact, we are considered the northernmost university in the world. Now, here's my first case study. It's about language change. And it connects language change to social and mental phenomena. And we're going to look at the decade construction in Russian. Now, lots of concepts here. I'm going to explain them one by one. So let's start with the concept of rival forms. What I have in mind are situations where 2 forms compete for the same slot in a language. So, for instance, in English, we have a competition between the suffixes ity and ness. So you can say universality, but you might also come across the word universalness. And the question is, why does English have these 2 suffixes that seem to do the same job? They sort of fill the same slot in the language, if you will. And that's what I mean by rivalry. We're not going to talk about English, and we're going to go to a fairly interesting case in Russian that is about decades, 10-year periods. So we are interested in finding out how you can say that something happened in the 20s, in the 30s, in the 40s, and so on. In other words, we're interested in events that take place within a 10-year period. How do you say that in Russian? Well, the point is that there are 2 ways. You can say в 20-е годы, or you can say в 20-х годах, both meaning in the 20s, literally in 20th years. The v is a preposition meaning in, and then after that comes an ordinal numeral here, 20th, and then comes a plural form of the word for year in Russian. But the point is that in the orange example, we have accusative, whereas in the blue examples, we have locative or prepositional. So 2 different cases sort of compete here. They are in a situation of rivalry. They are rivals. And that's what makes this interesting, at least to me. So there are 2 ways of saying that something took place during a 10-year period in Russian. Question: what is the historical background for this? How does this situation come about? Well, before I try to answer that question, let's look at 3 kinds of scenarios for rival forms and language change. Essentially, the situation we're dealing with is that we have 1 meaning, but 2 forms. So F1 and F2 are 2 different forms, and they seem to have the same meaning. So we have the construction with the accusative and the one with the locative, and they seem to have the same meaning. Now, many linguists, me included, think that language is something that takes place in the minds of individual speakers. So let's put this meaning form relationship within in the mind of a speaker. But at the same time, it's pretty clear that language is not only something that takes place inside the mind of an individual speaker. Language is also a social phenomenon. It's a social contract in a speech community, to use Saussure's term. So I've constructed here a fairly minimal speech community consisting of 2 speakers, both of whom have this form meaning relationship in their mental grammars. Now, what can happen in a situation like this? As I said, I'm considering three basic scenarios. The first scenario we can label semantic differentiation. Simply put, two forms develop different meanings. So we could illustrate it like this. Here you see that the situation that emerges has two meanings and two forms. So there is a one-to-one form meaning relationship. One meaning and one form. Each form has a different meaning. Another scenario would be what we could call socio-linguistic variation. Simply put, speakers then develop different preferences. So we could illustrate it like this. Here we have a blue speaker who have form 1 for the relevant meaning, whereas the red speaker has changed to form 2 for this meaning. So they have different forms for this meaning. They say things slightly differently. So this is what we would call a dialect or a sociolect or some other variety of a language. A third possible scenario is leveling of form. And here the situation is that one form osts the other. In other words, one form survives, the other disappears. So we could illustrate this like this. And now you see that form 2 disappears, dies. And we are back to a situation where all speakers only use form 1 for the meaning we're interested in. Now, my question is, how can the interplay of these factors be studied empirically? And as you understand, my suggestion is that these scenarios are not mutually exclusive, but actually might interact in interesting ways. We might get mixes of these scenarios. And the question is, how can we find out about these things using corpus data? Well, let's start with leveling over time. I created a database, took examples from Russian National Corpus, a wonderful and big corpus that is a great tool for everybody studying Russian. And I put together a database with approximately 5,000 examples, pretty much equally distributed among the two cases. And then I'm going to be looking at the development over time since approximately year 1800. It would be fun to go further back in time. Unfortunately, the corpus gets smaller and it's harder to carry out reliable statistical analysis of data from before 1800 in this particular corpus. We're going to divide the time into 25-year slots or periods, and then we're going to look at one example per author. That is because we want to avoid bias due to individual author preferences. If we had 1,000 examples by Dostoevsky in our sample would tell us a lot about Dostoevsky's preferences, but it wouldn't give us a very good view of the language situation in general. Obviously, Dostoevsky was not an average language user. So we have put together a database that has one example per author. And then we're looking at two parameters. We're going to look at both when the author of the texts when the author was born, and we're going to look at when the text itself was created. And here is a graph that represents the findings from this database. What we see here is the percentage of the accusative construction. So when the percentage of accusative is low, that means that the other rival, the locative rival, is high. So in the beginning here, we see that the locative was completely dominant. There was almost no accusative. And then we have a steep rise, and then it flattens out about 60% accusative. But this is a shape that linguists often refer to as an S-curve, and that's the concept that we're going to come back to, hopefully, towards the end of this talk. So essentially, we see that the locative once was the dominating construction, but then the accusative started to take over. So it seems that maybe the accusative is in the process of taking over for the locative. But let me remind you that the accusative has not reached 100%. We're just past 60%. It could, of course, continue increasing. You would have to come back in 50 years and ask me, and hopefully I would be alive to give you an answer. I would be 105 years, so it's not very likely. But it looks like it's kind of flattening out here. So maybe there is more to be said about this. If you wonder why these two curves are kind of parallel but not at the same time, that just means that the dates when the texts were created come about a generation later. That simply means that most authors of texts are adults. Okay. Well, since it seems that the leveling of form doesn't explain everything, maybe we should look into socio-linguistic differentiation too. And this corpus allows us to study the impact of genres. So we divided the texts into three groups: journalism, fiction, that is short stories, novels and plays, and then what we could use the umbrella term for science and education. Okay, here each curve represents one genre, and to cut the long story short, you see that the accusative increases for all genres. It's pretty much a parallel development over time. And the differences are not statistically robust. So genre appears not to be a very important factor for the choice of construction. Might be a factor, but not a very important one. Let's then look at the gender of the authors. So we have looked at compared texts by male authors and female authors. And here are the data, and as you see, those two curves are pretty much parallel. The accusative increases for both genders, and again, this doesn't seem to be of any importance at all. So probably not a very important factor. However, I decided not to give up completely, and we did a somewhat more sophisticated statistical analysis called CART. CART stands for classification and regression trees. And what this model does is to try to predict an outcome. For us, the outcome is either accusative or locative, and it does that by making binary divisions based on the factors that we give the model. Here is the tree that comes out of it. And if you haven't seen a tree like this before, I'm going to walk you through it. Don't worry. So let's look at the bar diagrams at the bottom here. They represent the distribution of accusative and locative for various configurations, combinations of factors. So in this node number 4 here, we see that we have about 65% of locative, the dark gray shade, and the rest is accusative, the light gray shade. And we see that for other combinations of factors, the the situation is different. Now, what are the factors involved? Well, the most important factor is time. So you see here that from the top, it first takes, it's called the birthday period here, but that really means the year of birth of the author. It takes this factor first, and then it divides the material into different periods. So that essentially tells us that the most important factor is simply time here, that the distribution changes over time. But it does actually put in genre and the gender of the author. But these factors are kind of marginal. If we compare notes 4 and 5, we see that the difference isn't enormous, and it's even smaller between note 7 and 8. So, okay, time is the most important factor, meaning that this is really a history about a story about leveling of form. But it seems that the genre and author gender maybe are peripheral factors here. Most importantly, CART shows how the factors interact. Now, let me summarize section 1 of the paper, the first case study. Essentially, what I'm trying to show is that corpus data plus some statistical analysis, maybe CART, maybe other models, that is enough to capture the interaction of factors over time. So you see that we can treat socio-linguistic differentiation, semantic differentiation, and leveling not as completely different scenarios, but scenarios that can combine in various ways. So they're not mutually exclusive, but interact. That's my point. And here is the facts about Russian in a nutshell. I'm not going to go through that. If you're interested in more details, on the last slide of this presentation, there is a bibliography, and you can go back to the publications that I refer to. Let's go to the second case study. We are going to be talking about analogy and meaning. And we're going to talk about Russian verbs. Now, analogy is a term that most linguists are very familiar with. But on the other hand, it is a term that's being used in many ways in linguistics and cognitive science. So let's remind each other what we are talking about. It's simply, in the way I'm going to be using the term, and change in language that is based on the resemblance between the relationship of things rather than between the things themselves. That's Raimo Anttila's definition. Here's an English example. So we have words like sing that have past tense form sang, and then we wonder what would be the past tense form of bring. Well, if we take the similarity between sing and bring into account, we might come to the conclusion that the past tense form is brang. And indeed, many speakers of English prefer the form brang, including one of my stepdaughters, who is a native speaker of English, and for the longest time insisted that the best past tense form of bring would be brang. Here is a diagram that illustrates this. We have two kinds of verbs with two forms, and they are related to each other, and there is a relationship here. So essentially, we have sing, and we have sang, and we have bring, and by analogy from the sing-sang pattern, we get bring, brang. Okay, so that's a very, admittedly, very traditional understanding of analogy, but one that is good enough for the purposes of this presentation. But I do want to add two principles about how analogy works. The idea is of the asymmetry principle is that large and productive classes have impact on smaller classes. So the big classes steal members from the small classes. That's why I often like to call this principle for the rich gets richer principle. Analogy is the kind of a linguistic version of a very aggressive capitalism, where the rich gets richer. So the sing class is bigger than the bring class, and therefore bring tends to migrate to the sing class and not vice versa. The other principle is what I would like to call the principle of proximity. In order for analogy to take place, the two classes must be closely related. It's not enough to be a big class to get new members. You have to get the members from a class that is somehow similar to your class. It's not too far apart from the other class. That's why I call it proximity. And the proximity of sing and bring is simply that they have infinitives and present tenses that rhyme and in ing. So that's why it's tempting to inflect sing and bring in the same way for speakers. Okay. Now to Russian. Here we have the inflected forms of two verbs. We have an unproductive class, and we have a productive class. So the productive class is big and the unproductive class is small. So that really gives us the asymmetry we need for analogy to take place. Okay, but we also need proximity, and indeed we do have that. If you look at the past tense and the infinitive, you see that they look the same for both types of verbs. So that sort of is the same thing, that sing and bring are similar. So that's why sing can steal the members of the bring class. So we have proximity. The paradigms are partially overlapping, if you will. So to recapitulate then, we have asymmetry. We have an unproductive and small class versus a productive and large class. And we have proximity. The two paradigms partially overlap. Well, then we would expect that verbs would move from the unproductive to the productive pattern. You know, rich gets richer. And sure enough, that is what seems to be happening. The verb to the left also have forms that are of the same kind as the productive class. So the result here is variation, and if we jump to conclusions a little bit, gradual shift towards the productive I class here. Okay. Details aren't very important about Russian. The point is that we have a small class and a big class, and they're kind of similar, and we expect the big class to steal the members from the small class, and indeed that seems to be happening. Now let's go to another class or to other classes of verbs, verbs that involve the suffix nu. You can see that the infinitives for both verbs here end in nuch. Che is the infinitive marker, and nu is a derivational suffix. Well, we have a productive and a non-productive class, and they seem to be fairly similar. They both have this nu. So we would expect analogy to take place here too. And at first glance, that seems to be the case. We see that if you look these verbs up in a dictionary, for instance, you will see that there are possible forms with and without nu in the past tense. So we have this zero versus nu. The sign with a strike through is a zero sign. So it means essentially that there is nothing there. So what's going on here? Well, one might think that there is analogy from the productive new pattern, and let's see what the corpus data will tell us. Okay, we have a database, fairly big, 34,000 examples approximately. We predict that the productive suffixes, I and nu, that we have looked at for those two examples on the two previous slides, will gradually go up. Here's what we see. For the I group, sure, it goes up, not very fast and maybe not all the time, but it seems to be generally on the increase. But the nu verbs move in the opposite direction here. Actually, nu goes down. Bad news, or what? Why isn't our expectation borne out by the facts here? Well, let's take a closer look at the data. There might be a crucial difference here. For the a and the I verbs, we really have two classes that have lots of similarities. I've shown that by these lines between the ovals. And we see that the imperative and the infinitive well, it's really the imperative and the present tense that changes. Those arrows are not placed exactly where they should. But anyway, if we look at the verbs with and without nu, we see that there are similarities, and we would maybe expect the past forms to change, but they don't. Well, why? Here's my explanation, which might be right or wrong. My explanation is that for the a and the I verbs, we have two classes of verbs with the same meaning. The different suffixes don't really have a different meaning. So since we have one domain with the same meaning, we have proximity, and an analogical change can take place. Here, we have actually two different meanings. The nu of the two types of verbs have different meanings and might be considered different suffixes, although they look the same. So we're dealing with two different meanings here. To make it very simple, we could call the suffix nu on the left here an inchoative suffix. It's sort of verbs that denote the beginning of a process. It's a little too simple, but it's good enough for our purposes today. And the other side here, the nu has a very different meaning, namely what Slavists tend to call semifactive. That really means a punctual action, something that happens once and often suddenly. Now, what we see here is that analogical change is local in the sense that you need to have two groups that basically have close enough meanings for analogy to take place. And these juxtaposing these two case studies really illustrates this. I decided to call it the semantic homogeneity constraint. Analogical change is restricted to semantically homogeneous domains. So that means that, simply put, you need to have the same meaning in order for analogy to be possible. Now, so far, so good. But if we take an even closer look at the data, we see something interesting. Here, I have split the inflected forms of the verbs that could have either nu or nothing in the past tense. So if you're far down here, that means that you have nu, and if you have and if you are high up here in the diagram, that means that you have the zero form in the past tense. So we see that some inflected forms seem to get rid of the nu more and more, and that pertains, roughly speaking, to the finite forms. And the zero form is almost obligatory here now. It's been rising a bit. For the non-finite forms, it's the opposite picture here. It seems that nu is dominant. Well, now you should ask why. Because I just told you that that analogy between the two kinds of nu verbs can't really take place because the suffixes have different meanings. But still, we see here that different inflected forms have different preferences. Well, this looks like a bad counterexample, but when you look more closely at it, I think it's not as bad as you would think. If you remember from the previous slides, that the nu is always found in the infinitive. The infinitive never has this rivalry between 0 and nu. So what I think is that the non-finite forms, the participles and the gerunds, have been influenced by the infinitive of their own verb, not by the other class of verbs. And why does this happen to the non-finite forms? Because they are most closely related to the infinitive. So that is also a small local domain within which analogy can take place. But of course, I admit it's somewhat speculative. You're invited to look at the relevant publication and see if you agree with me with my analysis. Let me summarize case study number 2. We have basically seen that corpus data shed light on analogical change, and we see that analogy is restricted to semantically homogeneous domains, local domains. And semantic differences can create barriers that prevent analogical change from happening. And then here's a short summary of the Russian facts in a nutshell. But let's go on to the next case study. Now, we're going to look at the network of related meanings and see how this category expands over time. Here is the background. We're going to be talking about semifactive verbs. I mentioned that very briefly, but semifactive verbs are perfective verbs, well, perfective aspect. They are unprefixed, and they have this suffix nu. And importantly, they denote a punctual event, something like do something once. So machnut means to do one waving motion, do it once. So this is the productive nu class from the previous study that we're going to look at in a historical perspective. Why are these words interesting? Well, we don't need to go into detail, but the main rule for Russian aspect is that you add a prefix, and if you do that, you get the perfective verb. And if you take a verb and add a suffix to it, you normally get an imperfective verb. But semifactives are different. Semifactive have a suffix that makes them perfective. We would expect prefixes to do the job of making verbs perfective. So this is a little strange. And then it's going to be interesting to see how did this category of semifactives develop historically. Is it possible to follow this development from Common Slavic to modern Russian? Well, I'm going to do a little attempt. And as you see here, I put up this little picture of an oddball. We are studying the oddball of the Russian aspectual system, the weird outlier in a sense, which is why it's interesting. Okay, so let's start with the early history. The Slavic languages inherited verbs with nasal suffixes already, and we already find them in Common Slavic. And the oldest texts that we have preserved are usually referred to as Old Church Slavic, pretty close to the situation in late Common Slavic. And in the Old Church Slavic texts, we find that there are new verbs that are compatible with the semifactive meaning, the do it once meaning. And it seems that sort of a division of labor was in the process of emerging. These unprefixed imperfectives with nu seemed to start having something similar to semifactive meanings, whereas the prefixed perfectives without nu developed what we could call normal perfective meanings. They have the meaning of sort of change of state, changing into a new situation. Very roughly speaking. So we have a verb like plinoti, which means to spit once then, and zaplivati, to spit perfective. Of course, this is rather speculative. First of all, we're dealing with a language that was written down 1,000 years ago or more. So it's not easy to know what the words really mean. And also, we don't have a lot of examples to build on. So speculative, yes. But at least to my mind, it seems that an embryonic version of the semifactive category was emerging in Old Church Slavic more than 1,000 years ago. Now, how did this category develop further? We're going to look at dictionary data and also some corpus data. Here, I'm going to talk about the radial category. That is a network of linguistic elements structured around a prototype. This is in the sense that George Lakoff uses the term. If you're not a cognitive linguist, you might not be so interested in this theoretical concept. That's fine. I think even if you aren't, you would be interested in seeing how sort of the network of meanings develop over time. So it seems that this category started developing with a prototype that we could label bodily acts, things you do with your body, either with your mouth, like spitting, or things you do with your hands, like touching. And we find some early attestations of verbs of this kind with nu and semifactive meaning. So that would sort of be the starting point. But then gradually, the category seems to expand to what we could call auditory verbs, verbs that have to do with sounds of various kinds, and optical verbs, verbs that you can that have to do with things you can see. And then finally, we find one example of a movement verb, the verb to dive into water. So it seems that sort of the category is expanding like this over time. So you see that peripheral subcategories show up. And when we get closer, we also get some other verbs in here. And here we are basing ourselves on corpus data. We see that the category is expanding. These are data from a study by Kuznetsova and Makarova, my colleagues. Okay, so here's the short summary. Corpus data and data from dictionaries can shed light on radial category networks. We see how they emerge and how they develop over time. We see a category growing like this. And here are the Russian and Slavic facts in a nutshell for those who are interested in those. Going on to the fourth case study, when a form acquires a new meaning. Problem here is how to say two new apartments in Russian. And the answer is that there are two ways. You can say dve novых kvartiry and dve novые kvartiry. And if you ask different Russians, you will get different answers. The ending is a genitive plural, and that's exactly what you would expect in a quantified noun phrase. So the question is really, what kind of animal is this red ending? And there are different ideas in the literature. I'm not going to go through them all, but I'm going to vote for the last of these three options. But let's see what corpus data can tell us about this rivalry. Well, the first thing it can tell us is that the red one is dominant in our time. Here we have data from two different corpora, but essentially showing very similar situations. So the red ending is most dominant in our time. The historical development we can look at from the Russian national corpus again. And here are three curves representing masculine nouns, feminine nouns, and neuter nouns in the middle here. And what do we see? Well, this chart measures the degree, the percentage of the endings. And what we see is that it started out with almost none of those. That is, the red endings were dominant for all three genders. And then we came to a situation here, mid-20th century, where had been growing a lot and was in the process of becoming the general rule. And then a split takes place in the mid-20th century, and the red ending it strikes back, and we see it ends up at the dominant ending for feminine nouns. Now, this might be an indication that we are developing a new construction, a new pair of forms and meanings. We see that in our days becomes the rule for feminine nouns. Okay, let's look at the bigger picture here, because construction like this with a numeral doesn't only include an adjective, of course. There is a numeral and there is a noun. So what happened? First, the numeral developed a separate feminine form, dve. That happened before the 18th century, roughly speaking. Then the noun developed a separate feminine form. That was in place sometime in the 18th century. And so we have a situation here. We have a feminine construction with the feminine form of the numeral, and then we have a non-feminine, masculine and neuter, with a different ending on the noun and a different form on the numeral. Okay, what happens then? Well, in the 19th century, we have variation for the adjective. So we have both the red and the green ending for both, for all three genders. And in the 20th century, the red ending disappears from the masculine nouns. So we can represent that like this, and we get only the ending, the green ending for the masculines. In the 21st century, roughly speaking, the green ending disappears and the red ending takes over for the feminine. Result, we see that the association of the adjective and the gender is the last stage in the birth of a gender-specific construction. First, the numeral got a separate form for the feminine, then the noun, and then the adjective is in the process of doing the same thing. So it's a truly long birth for a construction. It took several centuries. Now, back to the theoretical question here, and that is really about agreement. So, simple agreement, we have the ending E in the noun and Y in the adjective. This means strong arms. And we have a nominative plural of both the noun and the adjective. So that's wonderful. Let's look at the numeral construction. Here we have a feminine ending on the numeral. And we have a genitive, singular, feminine ending on the noun. And then the question, what is the adjective ending? Well, if we think about the situation over here, we would expect that it's nominative plural. But if we think of the fact that it seems that this form is the result of the development of a feminine construction, maybe it's feminine. I'm going to argue for the blue option here, even that is kind of unorthodox. So the argument for the blue analysis is that what happens when you hear an adjective in y, well, you can be pretty sure that the following noun is feminine. That's the information you get from the y ending. And that's really what agreement is about. And then you avoid a feature clash between the adjective and the other words in the construction. But there is a counter argument, namely that if you accept this analysis, then this ending y will have two meanings. It's feminine in these numeral constructions, and all other places it's nominative plural. Maybe that's not something that all linguists would be so happy about. Again, go back to the relevant publication, and you will have an opportunity background for being either in agreement or disagreement with my analysis. Again, we see that corpus data help us pinpoint these changes in agreement patterns. And we see that we can sort of follow this gradual development of a feminine numeral construction. And let's say that this inspires us to rethink analysis of agreement in the contemporary language. And you can disagree or agree with my suggestion. And here are some Russian facts in a nutshell. We are going to go to the fifth case study. Here, the problem is case marking on grammatical objects in Russian. Most verbs take objects in the accusative. That's sort of the default option for agreement in Russian. But there are some few verbs, smaller groups of verbs that take objects in other cases. For instance, the genitive. And in that sense, we have rivalry. Some verbs that traditionally govern the genitive also combined with accusative. So it's kind of, you find both cases in the object. So there are, in other words, there are two ways of being afraid of your wife. You can be afraid of your wife in the genitive, or you can be afraid of your wife in the accusative. Question: what is the distribution of the genitive and accusative in these verbs? And again, we're going to look at some corpus data and very briefly on some data from a questionnaire. So here's a list of the relevant verbs. And all you need to see here that there are only 10 of them, and only 5 of those 10 verbs have enough examples to make it possible to do an analysis. So, you know, it's a pretty small phenomenon in a sense. So question then is how to investigate such a low frequent phenomenon. That is not simple. So in a sense, this is a needle in a haystack problem. We have a Russian national corpus, again, fairly big. But the challenge is that we have very few examples with bayatsa plus accusative. So we can't just analyze part of the corpus. We really need to look at the whole corpus to get enough examples to analyze. But at the same time, there are so many examples with bayatsa plus genitive. So it's really hard to use the whole corpus. Okay, if we just got nice and beautiful examples from the corpus. But no, there is a lot of noise in the data, which means that we need to annotate the database manually. And it's impossible when you have like 100,000 examples. Here's our solution. We took examples with the accusative, the very infrequent variant in the whole corpus, and weeded out the noise manually. And then we created a random sample with examples with the genitive. You know, you can analyze 1,000 examples, and then you can weed out all the noise in that. And if you find that approximately 70% of the examples are good, well, now you can estimate, extrapolate to the whole corpus, and estimate that about 70% of all the examples with genitive are good examples, real examples. So, and based on that, it's possible to do a realistic comparison of the two constructions. First factor we need to look into is animacy, whether the noun is animate, that is a person or an animal, or it is not an inanimate. And what we see is that the accusative is extremely rare for inanimate nouns, less than 1%. If you look at the diagram here, you see that there is almost no red for the inanimate objects, whereas the animate objects have some red indicating the use of accusative. There's one exception, but it's low frequent, so it doesn't really change the overall picture. And here we find statistically significant differences with a reasonable effect size. So I call this the individuation hypothesis. Don't need to explain that here, but essentially it is that animates are more likely to take the accusative than inanimates. Okay, we looked at some experimental data, and just to cut the long story short, pretty much the same thing happened. And then we looked at diachronic data. And what we see here is that accusative is on the increase, and the green line here is aggregate data from all the relevant verbs, 5 verbs. And it's possible to compare the beginning and the end of these curves, and then we can see that there is a robust statistic difference. So it has really increased. And if we look at data from an experiment, we can make a similar conclusion. Younger people use more accusative, meaning that the accusative is probably on an increase. So essentially the same thing. And also here we find statistically robust findings. So some support from for the hypothesis that we are dealing with language change here. Well, here is a somewhat complicated network. Not going to say much about it since time is generally running out a little bit. But we see here that the animates, which are highly individuated, seem to like the accusative. There is a point about grammatical voice that I didn't have time to go into, but that's also part of the story. And then both type and token frequency is part of the story here. Go to the publication and you will see the details. The main point is what I for fun call the cocktail hypothesis. Case marking depends on a mix of different factors. And as you know, a cocktail is a mixed drink. So language is sort of like a metaphorical cocktail. It's mixed factors that interact. Obviously, it doesn't have anything to do with alcoholic beverages. So again, we see that we can shed light on interacting factors that have an impact on language change. And it's possible to combine corpus data and experimental data. And it's possible to get around problems with needles in haystacks the way we suggested. And then here are some facts about the Russian data in a nutshell. Okay. Now I should ask the moderator, should I do the 6th study, or should I jump to conclusions?
I think you should show us the sixth example, please. It's so interesting.
Thank you very much.
You still have some time.
Okay.
It's not a problem.
Okay, good. And it's not a lot of slides, so it's going to be fine. It's good to take it, but because it actually comes back to where we started. Remember that I briefly mentioned the concept of S-curves. So an S-curve, that's a curve that starts out flat and then has a steep rise and then flattens out again. And several linguists have pointed out that this is really how language change takes place. Sometimes this is referred to as Petrovsky's law, but that's not so important for us. Here is an illustration. We're going back to the competition, the rivalry between the locative and the accusative and the decade construction. That was the first case study. And remember, we had these nice curves. They start out flat, and they have this steep rise, and then they go, seem to flatten out again towards the end. So that's really how things should look according to many linguists. Okay, for this case study, it looks good, but let's try to look at some more complicated data. We're going to go back to the numerals that we looked at earlier. Remember the two ways of saying two new apartments. There were two ways, and they sort of changed over time in a kind of funny way. So, do we have S-curves here? Well, if you look at the solid line for masculine nouns, it looks pretty good. It starts out flat, and then you have this steep rise, and then it flattens out at almost 100%. Not bad. Then we look at the neuter nouns with these dotted lines, and it also looks pretty good. It has this steep rise, and then it flattens out here. Okay, it doesn't have this flat part in the beginning, possibly because we haven't been able to go far enough back in time. So maybe if we went like 50 years earlier, we would see a sort of a slow start. We don't know. So it could be, but it doesn't look like a dramatic counterexample either. And then for the feminine nouns, it looks pretty bad. It looks more like a bell-shaped curve than an S-curve, right? So what can be done here? Well, here I've actually manipulated the data somewhat. What I've done is first to view the feminine, the red line. I've only started the point where it breaks off from the masculine and the neuters. You know, first they went together, and then there was a split. And now we take only the part after the split. And then I've also represented it as an increase of the y ending rather than the decrease of the ending. And now we see that we have a flat start and we have a steep increase. Question, will it flatten out in the future? Again, you will have to come back in 50 years and ask me. Hopefully I will be alive, although I'm not so sure. I will be 105 years. There is also a sort of a cascading effect here. The red curve starts when the blue curves are almost at the top. So it seems then that what's happening is that first, the blue ending establishes itself as a rule. And then when you have a rule, a standard, then you can deviate from that standard. And then the feminine starts to grow in its own way. So This is my speculation, and again, it is really a speculation, but maybe it will inspire you to think differently. That would be good. So only when a general rule has been established does the next rule start developing for real. That's how I interpret these data. We see that corpus data can shed new light on S-curves in language change. That's my point. Okay, so let's conclude. Let me just give a very brief summary. We have looked at the decade construction rivalry. We see that there are three scenarios: semantic, socio-linguistic differentiation, semantic differentiation, and leveling. And the point is that they sort of interact. They are not mutually exclusive. Then we looked at the verbs in nu and I, and we saw that analogy takes place in semantically homogeneous domains. You need to have the same meaning in order to really make it possible for analogy to take place. Or so goes the story, right or wrong. Then we looked at the semifactive verbs, and we saw that corpus data sort of tells us how this network splits up and expands to more types of verbs. Then we looked at the numeral constructions, and we saw this split between the feminine gender and the non-feminine genders. So we got a gender-specific construction, if you will. Then we looked at case marking of objects. I talked mostly about animates versus inanimates, but I mentioned briefly that it's really a cocktail of different factors that are involved. And then we went back to the numerals and the decades, and we talked about S-curves as a hypothesis for what language change is. And we saw that corpus data could help us understand this better. So that's really the take-home message from this admittedly somewhat long presentation with lots of facts from Russian. Corpus data is a great tool that helps us test a wide variety of hypotheses and thus shed new light on language change. So that's what I wanted to tell you today. There's a little parenthesis at the end. Corpus data is great when we have enough of it, but very often we don't for older historical periods, and that's the curse of the historical linguist. But that's a different story. Here are some references and also my contact information. Feel free to send me an email, contact me. I will be happy to answer questions. And if you're interested in my publications and cannot access them, send me an email. I will send them to you. Thank you very much.
So, Professor Nesset, thank you very much for all you showed us about language change. And we are definitely convinced that corpus data sheds light to language change. There is no doubt about it. I would like to know if, how important, can we say that diachrony explains what synchrony can't?
You know, that's one of the biggest questions in linguistics, and it's a really hard one. I'm not sure. It depends a little bit what you mean by explain. That's a very big word. But it's clear that diachrony can do something that synchrony cannot do. And I think many of the strange facts in modern languages can be understood in a much more deep manner if we go back in history. If I may expand a little bit, I wrote a book a few years ago about the history of the Russian language, and sort of the pedagogical, you may call it a trick or a pedagogical approach, was to first in each chapter show a few idiosyncratic exceptions in the modern Russian language, and then explain how this had developed as the result of a historical development. What I'm hoping, what I was hoping when I wrote the book, and what I'm still hoping, is that for students that would deepen their understanding of modern Russian and help them master the exceptions of the modern language better, because they have this sort of historical perspective. Now, that was a long answer to a short but very difficult question.
Yes, I'm very curious about your book. I'm not very sure in Brazil it's easy to get access to it, but I never tried, so
well,
I don't know.
I could send you a copy. I don't have an electronic copy, so we would have to rely on the mail service, which is,
It's okay, don't worry. I'm just thinking out loud. All your examples, maybe not the last one, are a variation of two forms. Would it be also possible to explain the way you do with variation with more than two forms, 3, 4?
Interesting question. I am sort of, some people would say, obsessed with these situations of rivalry, but they can be much more complex than between two things. So it's definitely possible to have more than two things. I can't come up with an example off the top of my head from Russian, but that might just be because
Sure.
I haven't thought about it.
Sure.
But there is nothing in the methods and approaches that I have explored today that would prevent us from analyzing more complex situations with more than two rivals.
Sure. Would you like to say anything else? Would you like to explain something else that I maybe didn't think of asking?
Not really. I was very happy with your questions, and if people out there would like to watch this later on and have questions, they should just contact me. That's why I put my contact information on the second last slide, and it's also very easy to find me. You just Google my name and maybe add Russian or something, and you will find me easily. And I will be happy to answer all kinds of questions and discuss things about Russian language or the history of language and corpus data and all the fun things that linguists can do together.
All right. Yes. So I'd like to thank you again very much about telling us your point of view. And I hope people listen to the other lectures that we have at Abralim ao vivo. Thank you very much, Professor, and I hope to see you maybe in person one day.
That would be wonderful. Let's hope that
Sure.
This pandemic situation will pass and we can start seeing each other, not only in digital formats. Thank you very much for having me. It was a great pleasure and honor to contribute to your series of talks. Thank you.
Thank you. Very nice.